On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help. But because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing, 90 miles away, full-time. And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now, Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate, and as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning, and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition. Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed, with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows, arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do, because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in Sealing. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, "Don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it." But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, "Is Mom home?" And Tad said, "No, she's still not here." Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, "We got to call the police." 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So, Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now, Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, he said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy, could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like someplace if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, So on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend repeatedly to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise. Because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend, because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed, as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him, and Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that his plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere, and then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. He expected her to come home. This couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janetdennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer, Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach, like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, "Where were you on Friday night?" which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday, and now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and then he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill, because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, "Yep, Jim failed his test," which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. Because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with, huge adoration. They really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around Sealing that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes. But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, hey, would you mind taking this test again? But Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left: to sign a consent to search form, which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, "Sure." The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Undersheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the Undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now, Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire, and it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt the surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that this woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel, and she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news. Because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out. Nobody knew what happened to Janet. She had not turned up. It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, He wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of like the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy, who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again, and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, I have more information about Janet, and it might be important. And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. In 2006, Heather Kwan was a 21-year-old college student living in the small residential town of Desert Hills in Arizona. From a very young age, Heather was someone who always seemed to give her friendship to the people who needed it the most, people who were hurting on the inside or who society had kind of forgotten about. This is why when she was a teenager and a young adult, she would often spend her weekends volunteering her time with underprivileged children. It's also why she aspired to go to law school and become a defense lawyer, because she loved the idea of professionally helping people that desperately needed her help. She lived in a rental home with her boyfriend, who was 18 years old. His name was Ryan Waller, and amongst other things, he was a huge gun enthusiast and a student. That year, the couple had made plans to visit Ryan's father, Don, on Christmas Day, so on December 25th. But when the day came and Don had made dinner for the couple and was expecting them, they didn't show up. And so Don tried contacting both of them, but when he couldn't, he just had a bad feeling that something was off. It was just very uncharacteristic of them to just no-show. But instead of driving over to their property himself, Don just called the local police and asked them to do a welfare check. The police arrived at the house in Desert Hills, Arizona. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. They looked in the windows and some lights were on, but it was mostly dark inside, and they couldn't really tell from the car in the driveway if that belonged to the homeowners or somebody else. And so they stood there for a second, they're looking in the windows, there's no movement. They knock again while simultaneously calling out that, hey, we're the police, we're here to do a welfare check, just want to make sure you guys are okay. And this time, after they were done knocking, they heard the deadbolt unlock and then the door swung inward into the house, and standing right in front of them was Ryan. Ryan had this huge bruise on his left eye, this big black eye, and he had a cut on his nose, and he was just standing there, not saying anything, not asking any questions, just looking at them. And they looked past Ryan into his house, and they saw there was a woman lying on the couch, which they presumed was his girlfriend Heather, because that was the two people they were coming to look for. And so they turned their attention back to Ryan, and they asked him, what happened to your eye? And Ryan was a little bit cagey. He didn't really give them a straight answer. He basically said, I don't know. I don't know what happened to my eye. And, the police didn't really pry that much, but eventually they determined that Ryan was more or less okay, albeit a little bit strange. And then they said, okay, well, who's the woman who's lying on the couch? Is that Heather? And Ryan, again, was kind of cagey and a little bit dismissive and said something along the lines of, she's just sleeping. And so the police said to him, look, we're here on a welfare check. Your father sent us here to check on you guys. And so we have to go in there and wake her up and make sure she's okay. And so Ryan, again, was just a little bit weird and kind of defensive and didn't really immediately comply, but eventually did step out of the way. And the police walked into the residence. They walked over to the couch. And as soon as they looked down at the girl on the couch, which was Heather, they saw right away that she was not asleep. She was dead. And she had been for at least a couple of days. She had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. Immediately, Ryan was arrested and brought out to a squad car. He didn't fight the arrest, but he did emphatically say he didn't know what was going on. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know what happened to Heather. He just seemed kind of generally confused. But regardless, he was thrown in the back of the police car outside the property, and he would sit there for several hours while more and more police and paramedics arrived to process the crime scene and also to transfer Heather's body to a morgue. Finally, around 5 a.m. on December 26th, the police brought Ryan, who was still in the back of this police car, to the Phoenix police station for questioning. The interrogation that followed, this hour-long interrogation that was all filmed, would start off relatively normally, but it would quickly devolve into this totally bizarre back and forth between Ryan and the detective who was questioning him. And then at the end of the interrogation, there would be this stunning revelation. From this point until the end of today's video, we're going to be showing you clips from the actual interrogation. When you get to the end of this video and you hear the revelation, and trust me, you will not miss it, I would encourage you to then go back and watch the clips of the interrogation, or just go online and watch the entire interrogation, because it's totally mind-blowing watching this thing, knowing what's really going on. In the video, Ryan is led into this sort of nondescript, small interrogation room at 5:08 a.m. on December 26th. So he's just arrived at the station, they put him in this room, he's wearing this white jumpsuit that might have been issued by police, maybe he owned it, but it definitely looks more like prison attire. He's got no shoes on, no socks on, and his hands are not cuffed. And so he walks into the room and he sits down in the chair that's in the back corner of the interrogation room, and this chair is right next to this table, and then on the other side of this table is another chair. And so Ryan sits down in the corner, he's kind of facing out towards the middle of the room, he's quiet, he's basically not moving, and then at some point he notices there is a handcuff that's connected to this table. Now, in some cases, the police would handcuff the person they were interviewing in this room, but in this case, Ryan was not told that he needed to put this handcuff on. He was uncuffed, so there was no directive that he needed to have this handcuff on. After handcuffing himself to this table, Ryan turns and puts his arms over this table, and he lays down, puts his head in his arms, and he lays that way for about 5 minutes. Periodically, he makes a few groaning sounds, but for the most part, he's quiet. And then all of a sudden, as he's laying there, he suddenly makes a fairly loud moaning sound, and he stands up in his chair like he's gonna walk out of the room, but as soon as he starts to walk away, the handcuff stops him. The handcuff that he was not told to put on. And so he's stuck against this table, but he doesn't seem fazed by it. He looks almost confused by what's happening, but he doesn't dwell on it for very long. Instead, he just reaches across the table and grabs a blank piece of paper, and then he just sits back down in the seat, he crosses his legs, and he starts looking at this piece of paper. At 5:17 a.m., so roughly 9 minutes into this interrogation, which really hasn't even started yet, Ryan is intently looking at this blank piece of paper when a detective walks into the interrogation room. This detective was named Dalton, and he informs Ryan that they're going to be taking pictures of his feet, and so he needs to put his feet up on the table that's right next to him. Ryan at first acts very confused and doesn't really understand what's happening, but he eventually complies and he puts his feet up on the table, and by the time his feet are up there, another officer walks into the interrogation room, and he's got a camera and he's got this big kit with him, and he would begin about a 10-minute long process of photographing Ryan's feet and also swabbing Ryan's feet. During this 10-minute session, Dalton stays in the room, and so Ryan periodically asks him if he can just leave and go home, seemingly unaware of how serious this situation really was for him. And when Dalton would tell him, "No, you can't leave," Ryan would act totally frustrated and kind of angry and upset, kind of like how a child would act if they were told they couldn't have something they really wanted to. At 5:28 a.m., after this 10-minute session is complete and they've photographed and swabbed Ryan's feet, the second officer leaves the room, and Dalton shuts the door behind him, and then he walks over to the table and he grabs the chair on the other side from Ryan. He drags it out so it's closer to Ryan, and then he sits down and introduces himself. After that, he begins asking Ryan some very basic questions. He asks him to confirm his name, which he does. He asks him to confirm his date of birth and his social security number, and Ryan does both those things. And then he asks Ryan if he understands why he was there, why he was being interrogated. And Ryan says no. And so at this point, Dalton says, "Okay, let's just stop right now. I'm going to read you your rights." And so it's at this point in the interrogation that Ryan's behavior starts to get really, really weird. After Dalton tells Ryan he needs to read him his rights, you can see Ryan doesn't compute what he's saying. He's just kind of looking blankly, and Dalton seems to pick up on that. And so he tries to make it kind of lighthearted, and he says, "Hey Ryan, I'm going to read you your rights like they do on TV, like on Cops and on Law and Order and CSI, any of those crime shows, they read people their rights. That's what I'm going to do. You know what I'm talking about?" And Ryan just goes, "No." And Dalton's kind of confused. He's like, "You haven't seen any cop show where they read people their rights?" And at this, Ryan kind of changes his behavior, and suddenly he's not as robotic. He's a little bit defensive looking, and he says, "Oh, yeah, I have, yeah." At this, it's pretty obvious to Dalton that Ryan is lying about something that is totally insignificant, whether or not he's seen true crime TV shows. It really just didn't matter at all. And there's this weird hesitation where both of them are just kind of being quiet for a minute. It's like Dalton knows he's lying about it, and Ryan just seems totally confused. And then ultimately, Dalton just decides to not key in on this kind of weird lie that Ryan has just told. Instead, he just reads Ryan his rights. And then after that, he gets back into some basic questions. The next one was, hey Ryan, what was the highest grade you achieved in school? And now at this point, Ryan is not looking at Dalton. He's looking to the far side of the room. He's got this blank expression on. And when he's asked this question, he just says, I don't know. And Dalton's like, you don't know what level grade you achieved in school? And Ryan says, no, I don't know. Eighth grade. So again, he's changed his answer fairly abruptly when he's challenged. And so Dalton is probably thinking to himself that he's lying again. But again, it's just kind of an insignificant thing, but it's building a pattern of mistrust here. It's hard for Dalton to believe that Ryan is going to be truthful if he can't even tell the truth about things that don't matter. But Dalton decides not to fixate on it. Instead, he asks a follow-up question based on the fact that Ryan has said 8th grade is the highest level he achieved. And so Dalton says, okay, well, did you get your GED? A GED is a high school diploma equivalent, and it's something you would get if you did not graduate high school. And since 8th grade is below high school, then Ryan clearly did not finish high school, and so it's a natural question to ask. The answer to this question is binary. You have a GED, you don't have a GED. But Ryan's answer is anything but binary. It's totally contradictory and weird, and it really begins to show a side of Ryan that just doesn't add up. He's acting totally weird.
Do you have a GED?
I don't know.
You don't know what?
I don't know. I don't know. I just want to go home.
Oh, you're not going to go home right now.
So what?
What's the highest grade that you completed?
B?
No, not grade, as in letter grade. I'm asking, did you graduate high school?
No.
And the highest you went was 8th grade?
Yep.
Do you know how to read and write, Ryan?
Yeah.
After the discussion about Ryan's education goes nowhere, Dalton again does not fixate on all the issues with his answers so far, and instead just kind of continues asking more questions. And so he begins to address Heather. He starts by asking Ryan if he has a girlfriend. Now, Dalton at this point would know that Heather, the girl who was deceased, was Ryan's girlfriend because the police were asked to do the initial welfare check on Ryan and Heather, the couple. That's something that Dawn would have relayed to police. And so Dalton knows they have a relationship, but he wants Ryan to tell him he has a relationship with Heather. So again, he asks Ryan, do you have a girlfriend? And Ryan says no, which is a lie. But Dalton goes along with it and says, okay, well, do you know a girl named Heather? And Ryan would say, yes, I do. But his description of Heather was just completely inaccurate. He said Heather was a 16 or 17-year-old girl, even though she was actually 21. And he would say her last name was Kyman. He thought. He wasn't entirely sure. He said she has nicknames and she has different names she uses, but he believes it's Kyman, even though her last name was actually Kwan. Now, Dalton, of course, is aware of these discrepancies, but again, he does not fixate on them. He just keeps on asking more questions. Dalton asks Ryan, what happened to your face? You have this huge bruise on the left side of your face. What happened? At first, Ryan says he doesn't know. But when Dalton pressed him and kept asking more and more questions about his face and how it happened, Ryan eventually would begin to open up.
What happened to your face?
I don't know.
You told the officer just a few minutes ago that someone hit you. Do you remember who hit you?
I don't know. I think it was Heather.
Why would Heather hit you?
I don't know. It was an accident. I forgot why.
Like the other police officers involved, Dalton believed already going into this interrogation that Ryan killed Heather, that the bruise on his face was from Heather fighting back before ultimately Ryan killed her. And so for Ryan to say the mark on my face is from Heather, even though he claimed it was an accident, to Dalton, that was the same thing as Ryan saying, I killed Heather. Dalton attempted to get more specific details about the actual physical struggle that took place between Ryan and Heather, but as he asked more and more questions, he became more and more aggressive, and it seemed like Ryan picked up on it and became very defensive and started throwing out random pieces of information, much of which seemed untrue. Like he suggested there was at least 2 or 3 other people that were in the house on the night that Heather got killed, but it's unclear if these people were real or if they were actually ever there. And it just seemed like Ryan was kind of panicking and just kind of saying all sorts of random things. And so at some point, Dalton just wants to focus the conversation because he feels like it's getting totally out of hand. And so he just stops Ryan and he says, Ryan, there is a dead girl in your house and I need information.
Hey, Ryan,
Huh? Huh?
there's a dead girl in your living room.
She's dead?
Yes.
Heather?
I don't know. I want to know what happened in your house last night.
The girl on the couch is dead?
I don't know if she's on the couch. She's dead.
The interesting thing about Ryan's reaction to being told by Dalton for the first time in the interrogation that there was a dead girl in his house is Ryan reacted with genuine surprise. It's the only time in the entire interrogation, start to finish, where Ryan sits forward in his chair, he kind of perks up, and he seems relatively normal. He's not acting confused and kind of bizarre. It's like he's really dialed in, as if he had not heard this before, that he didn't know Heather was dead, and he's now for the first time being told, and it shocked his system. But just seconds after he sits forward and seems really engaged, he goes back to kind of being totally bizarre. And he also suddenly had this really elaborate story about what happened to Heather, even though just seconds ago, it seemed like he had just learned about it. So it didn't really make any sense that he would have a story so readily available for something he seemed to not know anything about. And of course, like all of his other answers, his story he gave was full of contradictions and holes and was just totally unbelievable.
Well, these people came over, Richie and his dad, with shoot and arrow, bow and darts. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
They hit me and her with those. That's it.
They hit you and they hit you?
Yeah.
Now it's Richie that hit you, not Heather?
No, Richie and his dad.
Richie and his dad. They hit you.
Yes.
Why?
Because they're trying to get their stuff. I don't know why.
And they had some kind of bow and arrows?
Mm-hmm. They each had 2 revolvers and they didn't let off any shells.
Okay, you just said they had bow and arrows. Now they have revolvers?
That's what I meant. They had revolvers.
They have revolvers.
Yes.
And then what happened?
And then they shot us with those.
Following this exchange, Ryan would change his story again and would say, actually, they didn't shoot me, they just shot Heather, they put me in a sleeper hold. But when Dalton asked him, what do you mean sleeper hold? Ryan said, oh, I don't know what a sleeper hold is. And then eventually Ryan would actually just ditch the sleeper hold narrative and go back to the Richie and his father, they came in and they shot both of us. At this point, Ryan's story has become so convoluted and it's changed so many times that it's just totally unbelievable. And so Dalton, who was doing his best to kind of go along with Ryan's story, at this point just can't even pretend anymore. He cannot pretend that he's following this story. It doesn't make any sense.
You're telling me you're all over the board here, number one. You're saying bows and arrows, you're saying revolvers, and you're saying some other thing, and you're saying they shot you in the eye. Okay? They shot you with a revolver in your eye.
Yes. And that's
Is it a BB gun?
No, it was a real gun, man. It was just a
If
revolver.
they shot you in the eye with a revolver, you wouldn't be talking to me right now.
How do you know?
It was most likely you'd be dead.
That's what I thought too, man. I really don't know.
So you got shot first,
Uh-huh.
and what happened? Did you fall to the ground?
Yeah, I was trying to get up and I couldn't. I don't
Okay.
know.
And then she got shot?
Mm-hmm.
What did you do?
Nothing.
Did you call 911?
Uh-uh.
Did you see if she was alive?
She was sleeping still, and that's it. I just let her sleep.
She got shot in the side of the face and you let her sleep?
Yes.
This does not make sense, Ryan.
After this exchange, Dalton just goes full bad cop on Ryan, openly accusing him of shooting and killing Heather, and Ryan just continues to say he doesn't know anything, that he didn't do it, and his answers are just totally nonsensical and contradictory, and nothing is making sense. And so finally, at 5:52 a.m., roughly 45 minutes into this interrogation, Dalton is just at a loss. He does not know how to handle Ryan, because even though he really believes he did it, nothing Ryan has said has incriminated him, because nothing Ryan has said makes any sense. And so he's sitting there kind of thinking what he's going to do next, and then Dalton notices something. He notices something on Ryan's face. And he tells Ryan to come closer. He needs to look at it.
Let me see your nose. Put your legs down. Put your legs down. Bring your face closer.
Oh, my head hurts.
Okay. Yeah, be right back.
What Dalton had finally just discovered were 4 bullet holes in Ryan's face and head. Ryan had committed no crime. He was a victim the same way Heather was a victim, but somehow Ryan had survived the attack. On December 23rd, so 2 days before the welfare check, 2 men attempted to break into Ryan and Heather's house. They were 23-year-old Richie Carver and his 54-year-old father, Larry Carver, the same Richie and Richie's father that Ryan had mentioned during the interrogation. They were there because of an altercation that had occurred between Richie and the couple about a month earlier. During that time, Richie was actually living with Ryan and Heather, but apparently he began hitting on Heather, and Heather told Ryan, and Ryan got really mad about it, and Ryan and Richie got in this big fight, and ultimately Ryan kicks Richie out of the house. Now, this totally infuriates Richie and is very embarrassing for Richie, and so right away he begins plotting his revenge. And so on December 23rd, Richie and his father, they were there to carry out this revenge plot. When the father and son got to the back of Ryan and Heather's house, Ryan saw them at the back door through the glass door that was near their kitchen, and he ran over to try to stop them from getting inside, but Richie and Larry managed to barely get open the door, and Richie reached in with his hand, which was carrying a gun, and he shot Ryan point blank twice in the face. The first bullet went in through his nose and then out the other side of his nose, so that's the first 2 bullet holes. And then that bullet traveled back into his head through his left eye into his brain where it got lodged. And along with the bullet, 6 pieces of his skull that broke off from this bullet went inside of his brain as well. So that's the first 3 bullet holes. And then the second bullet that was fired into Ryan's head hit the side of his head. It did not penetrate into his skull. So the bullet didn't lodge anywhere inside of his brain. However, it did break off a piece of his skull. And so that was the 4th bullet hole. Ryan dropped to the ground. He was unconscious. They assumed he was dead. They managed to force the door the rest of the way open. They stepped inside. They stepped over Ryan's body, and they walked into the living room where Heather was cowering on the sofa, and Richie just immediately walked up, put a gun to her head, and fired a single shot. After she had fallen to the ground, the 2 men stole some things in the house and then fled the scene. They would ultimately get caught, and they're both currently serving life sentences. It's believed Heather died instantly from her gunshot wound, but Ryan didn't. At some point, maybe a couple of hours after he was shot, he woke up, but he had severe brain damage and he wouldn't have known what was going on. He didn't really know what happened, and he saw his girlfriend Heather lying on the couch, but he thought she was just sleeping, and so he too went to his bedroom and he fell asleep. But the next morning, he woke up and he still would have had no idea what was going on, and he spent the day on the 24th just kind of wandering around his house with his girlfriend lying dead on the couch. And so after a full day of just kind of mindlessly walking around his house, he went back to bed, and then he got up on Christmas Day on the 25th and spent another day just kind of walking about his house with his girlfriend, who he believed was sleeping, but really she was dead. And so finally the welfare check is called in, the police show up, and as soon as they see Ryan, they jumped to conclusions that he must have killed Heather, and it kind of dictated the way they treated him. Had they believed he was a victim, they might have sought medical attention for the wound on his face, But again, jumping to conclusions and assuming he was the killer, they figured that bruise on his face was from the woman fighting back. She had struck him before he had savagely killed her. And so they didn't give him any medical care. Instead, they put him out in the cop car out front of the property, and he sat there with no medical intervention for 6 hours. And during those 6 hours, literally every second that went by, there was irreversible brain damage being caused because he had all this bleeding inside of his head that was causing brain damage. And so the clock was ticking as soon as they found him, and for hours and hours and hours, he got no care and was just getting worse and worse and worse. And so finally, he goes to the police station, and again, they do not give him any medical care. Instead, they interrogate him for almost 2 hours, even though he has 4 bullet holes on his face that apparently no one noticed or no one took seriously. But regardless, he spent those almost 2 more hours in the interrogation room, where every second that's going by, his brain is getting more and more destroyed, irreparably destroyed. And then finally, at the end of the interrogation, Dalton, who's probably thinking to himself, what is wrong with this guy? His answers don't make any sense. He's all over the place. And that's when he stepped back from looking for a way to convict this guy and noticed the holes on his face, specifically the hole in his nose. And that's when he called him forward and he looked at his face and he realized a huge mistake had been made, and he called an ambulance. Here is a clip of the fire department who arrived ahead of the ambulance in the interrogation room, learning about what's happened to Ryan as they wait for the ambulance.
Hi guys. Hey guys. Captain, you're not going to believe this one.
I can't believe it either. You're right. I've already heard the story. I can't believe it.
This is just my observations that this might be an entrance, this might be an exit, this might be into his eye. And he's acting like he has a serious head injury, which would make sense.
Ryan was ultimately rushed to the hospital, where he would undergo emergency surgery that would save his life, but it would come at a great cost. They not only had to remove a large portion of his brain, but they also had to remove both of his eyes. Now, it should be noted that at least one other source says he only had his left eye removed, but regardless, after this surgery, Ryan was no longer independent. He had so much brain damage, he couldn't take care of himself, and so he had to move back in with his parents, who became his full-time caretakers. And then 10 years later, Ryan would die from a seizure that was directly connected to the injuries he sustained from that attack, and it's connected to the lack of care he received in those first critical 8 hours after the police found him. The Phoenix Police Department, after this mishandling of Ryan's case went public, they did an internal investigation, but no one was ever disciplined, at least not publicly. As for Ryan's family, they certainly could have filed a lawsuit against the Phoenix Police Department, but they chose not to. They said, the only thing we want is our son back, and a lawsuit will not give us that. Austin Harroff was born on December 21st, 1996, to a dentist and a pharmacist. They lived in a beautiful home in Palm Beach County, Florida, which is not only one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in Florida, but it is one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in all of America. And that's why, as of 2021, there are 44 billionaires that call this paradise their home. In 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, his parents suddenly got divorced, and within the same calendar year, both of his parents had new girlfriends and boyfriends. Now, of course, this was a shock to Austin and to his 1 year younger sister, Haley, but they both relatively quickly adjusted to their new normal. And that was in large part because the kids didn't move out. They stayed in the family home with their mom, and their father, he did move out, but he moved into a home that was very close by. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and immediately he excelled. He was placed into all advanced classes, and within these advanced classes, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He was about 6 feet tall and weighed about 200 pounds. And so naturally, he played football for all 4 years he was in high school. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also wrestled. But despite his size and willingness to play these very rough physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive guy. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. And on game days, they would try to make him mad in hopes that would inspire him to go out there and smash some people. But it really didn't work because Austin was Austin. He was just kind of a laid-back guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than smashing them. In fact, towards the end of high school, Austin became obsessed with trying to identify a career that would allow him to help the most people. And he was so passionate about this that when he spoke about it, a huge smile would kind of involuntarily appear on his face. And so because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy disposition, his father very lovingly began referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's graduation in 2015, he received a letter in the mail from Florida State University, and it was informing him he had been accepted into their 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being his intended career path to help the most people, and so being accepted into this very prestigious program was like a best case scenario. And so Austin and his family were elated, and that summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud nine. He spent a lot of time with his family and his friends, and then finally at the end of the summer, his family packed all of his stuff into the car and they drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was. They helped move him into his dorm, and then afterwards they gave him a big hug, said good luck, and they left. And I'm sure on their ride back, the family members thought to themselves, Austin is doing so great. He is not only ready for college, he is ready to be an adult. He's ready to live on his own and be responsible. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that supposition about him ready to be an adult seemed to be accurate. Austin got excellent grades, he met a nice girlfriend, and even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding, and he had actually built a decent-sized social media presence around bodybuilding and fitness. But underneath all of this public success Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time. He just wasn't telling anyone. In a journal he kept, he documented a deep sense of inadequacy caused primarily from his sense that his peers didn't accept him. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy and be more assertive and outgoing, that more people would embrace him and would like him and would accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started abusing different substances. Those included things like alcohol, marijuana, and Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a drug that is a stimulant, and it's used to treat people with attention deficit disorder. He also experimented with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he also tried MDMA, which is kind of like a cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogenic. And those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible he was taking other drugs too. Regardless, Austin began oscillating between the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on to the low of his sober mind, which was totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of the school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown, and it seemed like he knew it was coming too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history is filled with questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do? And how do you know if you're crazy? And how to deal with obsessive thoughts? And do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear he was starting to question his own sanity. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State that summer, his family immediately noticed there was something wrong with Austin. Within a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his bedroom down into the garage, claiming that the reason he did this was because the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night, never stopping, and every 2 hours he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members and loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This was so unbelievably weird and totally out of character that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious there was something wrong, they didn't jump into action. Instead, the only thing they did at first was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed and Austin continued to act totally weird with no explanation, his family began to become convinced that he must be on drugs, that is what would explain all of this totally strange behavior. And so when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit that he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. He's taking all these drugs. And so naturally, his family latched on to his drug use as being the root cause of his very strange behavior. And so they focused their efforts almost exclusively on getting Austin clean again. But towards the end of the summer, Austin said he wasn't taking any drugs, but Austin was still acting totally crazy and unhinged. And so around mid-August, the family decided they had to utilize something called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals in Florida who are suspected of severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the behest of their loved ones. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed to see what's going on with them. And then at the end of those 72 hours, they are given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. But before the family could utilize the Baker Act, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, who he had known since second grade, said Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead of time or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. And when this friend opened the door to see what Austin wanted, Austin just asked him, "What year was I born?" And so the friend says, 1996. And as soon as Austin heard this, he didn't give a reaction to it. He just turned around and he left. And so this longtime friend is looking at Austin walking away, wondering, like, what's going on with this guy? Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? Like, what was that? So the friend goes back inside his house and he's thinking to himself, like, what should I do? And so after a couple of minutes, he decides, you know what, I got to call Austin and make sure he's okay. So he calls Austin, Austin picks up, and it's unclear what they talked about on the phone, but the friend convinced Austin to come back to his house and to just spend the day with him. But really, the friend just wanted to make sure Austin was okay. And so Austin comes back to the friend's house, and then the two of them actually would leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends that were in town that summer, as well as meet up with Austin's sister. And so the group, they decide they're going to go to the beach for the day. And on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something at his house and that he will meet them down at the water. And so at this point, the group believes Austin is just fine. So they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. And so Austin breaks off. He goes to his house. And when he goes back to the beach and meets up with his group of friends again, he's changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches and he had on sunglasses. And so as he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him, and it's super hot out, and they're at the beach. So this is a totally weird outfit to have on. And immediately they start kind of giving him crap about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. And at first he was quiet, but then he kind of lashed out and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." And at this, his friends did not give him any more crap. Everyone just said, "Okay, man, hey, didn't mean anything by it, just giving you a hard time, no big deal." But Austin's like clearly worked up, and so his sister comes over to him and she's like, "Hey, calm down, it's okay, it's not a big deal." And during this conversation, Austin suddenly goes back to being normal again, and he turns to his sister and he says, "I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal." And his sister's like, "What? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help." Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. And he said, "I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help. You're right." And so after that, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several hours. And then in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and Austin's very close friend, who was the guy that saw Austin in the morning when he asked, what year was I born, they all said they had to leave. And so the trio, they leave the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a restaurant in town. And they were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. And so as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, they're nearing this restaurant, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, "Hey, I need to test out my immortality." And he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, towards traffic, and just starts walking into traffic like he's going to let a car hit him to test his immortality. And so his sister immediately was able to grab him and pulled him back onto the sidewalk, and then basically stood on the left side of him, preventing him from running out into traffic, and kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of this restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk out into traffic. He was acting normal again. And it was there that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend, and the 5 of them went into Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside, and they were very quickly sat in the very back of the restaurant in this booth. And so there was a CCTV camera that watched them while they were inside this building. And so they're sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up and walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom, but then stops, doesn't go to the bathroom, turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then walks out the front doors, just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table, except this time, instead of feigning going to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. And so she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen, drinking vegetable oil, and there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. And so she runs up to him and she grabs the vegetable oil and she puts it down and she tells him to stop, at which point Austin does stop. And then I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes because perhaps he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. And so she watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door and then she drove off. And so about 30 minutes after he left that second time, Austin walks through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly says something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. And it would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him, and he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" And at this, Austin just stands up and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there, and then at some point he just lets go, he leaves the booth, and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him, and so by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went, and so he quickly came back in the restaurant. He told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was, and so at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they didn't know where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself or someone else, and so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from this restaurant, 53-year-old Michelle Mishkon was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 59-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog, so for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. They had 3 kids together from previous marriages, and they were just totally in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. That was basically like their living room. They loved having the door wide open so they could wave to neighbors and flag people down to have a drink with them or just chat with them. They were just known to be a very happy, loving couple that were fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her financial advisory job. And the two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog, and then also spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor across the street was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs anytime they went away, and he would often go in their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so this particular night, he was over in his house and he was going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window across the street, over near John and Michelle's property. And so Jeff sits up in his bed and kind of strains his ears to see what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. And so Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door, and he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway, and he begins walking up the driveway, and at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle is standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified, and she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harif. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was he heard this scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look good. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. And so Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." And now Jeff, he's a pretty big guy, and so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle, and he had no idea where John was. And so he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin, and as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. And so Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, in his neck, on his back. And he looks down and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one swing. And so Jeff believed at the time this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it straight across the street to his house. Never once did he turn around to see if this guy was after him. He figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911.
Please, have medical. Young man beating up a woman across the street.
Are either of them injured? Can you tell from where you are?
Yes, there's a girl laying on the ground. He beat her up. I ran over there. I'm bleeding profusely here at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
Can you tell if she's conscious?
No, it does not appear so, no. I've been stabbed in the back. I'm bleeding pretty bad.
After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious, but all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac, Austin, has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person, if it's 2 people, if it's male, if it's female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan, and the first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. And so Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are 2 cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. And so he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground right in front of the car, so he can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at, and he sees there's this man lying on the ground, his eyes are open, he's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen and he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens, and on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place, and then then he had his right arm and he was doing something to John's face. But Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was there was clearly an aggressor and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin into John, killing John. And so Dan tells Kristen, hold on, I'm gonna tase him. And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser, and right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face. With his free right hand, he was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. And so Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin, but it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. And he tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip. He goes back and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again, right as another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine, they had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body, and so his arm is back like this again, and Austin, again, unfazed, just yanks his arm out of the dog's teeth, again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm, and this time when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back, and he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back, and he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do, and so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him. The whole time, Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. And so ultimately John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack. It was unharmed, and it was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was laying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital where it was determined he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested, but the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's drug abuse history, that he must have been on some drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful, and at the time they were quite popular in Florida, and they'd caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana, and then the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital, which meant at the time of this attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember, I don't know," but eventually he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that, he saw this dark figure outside with a white face, and he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there, he said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog, and Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him, but he probably came off looking completely insane, and Michelle screamed, at which point Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch, and so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk, but we don't know for sure, and frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with, because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher, he has no recollection of John or what he looked like, and he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face, and he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank, and then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin, and he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 38-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there's threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister that he believed he was half horse, and then on a couple other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie. But this was not a movie, this was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist, TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help, and he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon, especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-okay, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come with you to the zoo. And then when you're there, accidentally spill honey on them and then push them into the bear enclosure. In 1990, 31-year-old John O'Brien was a landscaper in a town just outside of Chicago, Illinois. In January of that year, he and his friend David decided they wanted to escape the cold Chicago winter and go on some vacation to somewhere nice and warm. And so they decided to book a trip to the very sunny Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. They left for their trip just a couple of days later, which was believed to be January 8th or January 9th, and the hotel they were staying in was right near the airport in Trinidad. So they land in Trinidad, they get off their plane, they make their way out of the airport, they go to their hotel, they drop their luggage, and then they headed out to explore the town. And over the next couple of days, they not only explored Trinidad, but also the island of Tobago, which was a 4-hour boat ride away, and they had great food, they saw some really cool attractions, and just overall, they had a chance to relax in the warm weather while all their friends back home were freezing in Chicago. And so, by all accounts, their vacation was going exactly to plan until Sunday, the 14th of January. This was the day before they were supposed to fly back to Chicago. That day, John began complaining of some unnamed health issue, which has not been made public, so we don't know what it is, and he went to some drugstore in town in Trinidad to look for a specific medication for this unnamed health issue. But the drugstore did not carry this medication, so John left and he went to another drugstore and another store, but nobody had this medication. And so by the time John got back to the hotel and saw David, David would later remark that John was not only distraught about not having this medication, but John was disoriented. Like whatever this health issue was, it was starting to manifest itself in this kind of disoriented state that John was in because it was not being treated. But eventually, David decided that John was okay enough that they did not need to call a hospital or call a doctor, and the two men decided to just go to bed because after all, they had a very early flight the next morning. So the two men climb into their respective beds, which are in the same room, 2 twin-size beds, and they fall asleep. But about an hour to maybe an hour and a half after David had fallen asleep, he wakes up to some man standing next to his bed, choking him. He's grabbing his throat and throttling him. And so David has no time to respond to what's going on. He just starts grabbing this guy's hands and he manages to push them off of him. And then this guy who's standing next to his bed grabs the lamp next to him and smashes David with it. David, from getting hit, falls out of the bed. He lands on the ground, and this guy, his attacker, jumps on top top of him, and the two men are fighting, but eventually David manages to overpower this guy and he kicks him off. And as soon as he does that, he realizes this guy that's been attacking him is John, and John is completely naked. He's got no clothes on. And so John just stands up and David's looking at him like, what's going on? And John just runs out of the hotel room. He ends up running down the hall. He goes down the stairs. He runs past the front desk, out the front doors of the hotel, and just takes off running. And so John runs for several minutes until he reaches the airport, but instead of going through the front gates, he goes to the side of the front gates where there are these huge chain link fences with barbed wire at the top. And John, again, wearing no clothes, climbs up the chain link fence and then manages to navigate the barbs at the top and drops over onto the other side. But where he landed, although it was on airport property, it was kind of like a trap because this airport had two fences around its perimeter back to back. And so where John landed was like this grassy no man's land between these two fences. But John was on this kind of deranged mission, so he stands up and instead of trying to get back out again, he turns and climbs the next fence, the one that is closer to the airport. And so he climbs up this fence, he manages to get past all the barbed wire at the top, and he drops into the parking lot on the other side. He stands up and just continues running towards the main building of the airport. But between him and the main building of this airport is this huge concrete wall that doesn't look like it has any place to grab onto to climb over it. But John runs up to this wall and manages to climb up and over the wall. And where he landed on the other side was right next to this security guard shack. And so he comes crashing down, and the 4 security guards that are in this shack, they see him come over the wall. They see this naked guy just suddenly appear, and so they charge out to apprehend him and figure out what's going on. But John apparently attacked them. We don't know exactly what he did, but he managed to overpower all 4 of them, and he stole their 4-wheel drive vehicle. And so John just bombs away from the security guard shack with the 4 security guards chasing him on foot. And John, he weaves around the outside of the main airport building and he heads out onto the tarmac. Out on the tarmac, there were several planes that were moving into position for takeoff. One of those planes was this huge British Airways jet airliner passenger plane that was actually the next to take off. They'd already fired up their engines and they were sitting at the top of the runway just waiting for clearance. And John just drives directly into this plane. But the vehicle he was driving, this little 4-wheel drive vehicle, it was not tall enough to actually strike the main body of this plane. So instead, when he hit this plane, he basically got wedged underneath one of the wings. At this point, the 4 security guards that had been attacked and had their vehicle stolen from them, I mean, they're running towards the tarmac, but they've also alerted other security personnel in the airport who are all streaming out onto the tarmac towards this British Airways plane and this vehicle and John. And so as they are descending on the scene, the security guards would see John from the passenger seat of this 4-wheel drive vehicle. He stands up and they can see he's got a pretty nasty cut on his shoulder. And John reaches up and starts rubbing his hand on the underside of the plane, which had been damaged from running into it. And there was oil leaking off the underside of this plane. And John began rubbing this oil around and then dabbing it into his big wound on his shoulder. And then after packing it with this oil, John leapt out of the wrecked 4-wheel drive vehicle and then just took off running away from all these security guards and away from this plane. And in the chaos of this moment, all these security guards and all the airport personnel that were descending on this scene, they managed to lose sight of John. He disappeared on the backside of this plane. And so all these security guards and airport personnel, they come to a stop about 100 feet away from this plane and this wrecked vehicle, and they're just kind of staring at it, wondering, what are we going to do next? They're calling other agencies to come in and assist with this situation, when all of a sudden, somebody notices John about 300 feet away on the other side of the plane. He comes out from behind a building. And so he's running towards the plane, he's running towards this wall of security guards and other airport staff, and John, he manages to get all the way up to the plane before anybody can come up and apprehend him. And when he reaches the plane, he stops for a second, looks up at the engine of this airplane that's still spinning, it's been turned on, and John jumps into the engine, and instantaneously John ceases to exist. He is completely decimated. No one knows for sure what actually caused John's rampage, although it's assumed it had to do with whatever this unnamed health issue was. Ultimately, his death was ruled a suicide. One of the most dangerous Olympic sports is called luge. In a nutshell, one or two people who are called lugers will ride a sled down a hill as fast as they can. But this hill is this narrow, winding, banked ice track, and these lugers will ride a sled that will go as fast as 80 miles per hour or faster. While accidents in luging are actually quite uncommon, when they do occur, they can be catastrophic. In 1986, a luge track was built on a ski hill in Alberta, Canada, for the luge event of the 1988 Winter Olympics. This track and the surrounding ski area was called Canada Olympic Park. After the Olympics were over, this park was open to the public for recreational purposes. Nearly 30 years later, on January 29, 2016, 3 teenage boys snuck into Canada Olympic Park after hours. They made their way up the hill until they reached this blue 6-foot-tall fence that was covered with warnings telling people to stay back and don't go past this fence unless you are authorized personnel, and these 3 teenage boys were not authorized personnel. Inside of this 6-foot-tall blue fence was what looked like this tall flight of stairs that led up to what looked almost like a log cabin. And that cabin was the starting house of the luge track. The track literally came out of the cabin and fed down below. The 3 boys, one of which had actually worked at this park the winter before selling tickets, they looked at each other and grinned and then chucked their plastic sleds over this blue fence, and then they climbed up and over themselves. Once on the other side, they each picked up their sled and then made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they kind of arranged themselves to see who would go first, second, and third. They put their helmets on because they all brought helmets. They strapped on headlamps so they could see the course because there were no lights on the course. And then one by one, they began going down this luge track. But surprisingly, it wasn't that fast. As they went down, they would actually stop and have to use their feet to get going again. But that was because they had these cheap plastic sleds that were not designed for this luge course. What you needed were these specialty sleds with blades on the sides that got you up to full speed. And so after the 3 boys eventually, slowly, painfully made their way all the way down to the bottom of this luge track, they were pretty disappointed, but they thought, okay, well, let's just all get in one sled and we'll go down again, and with the added weight, we should go faster. And so they marched their way back up, all the way up to the top of the starting house, and all 3 of them sat in one sled and they pushed off, and sure enough, they went way faster. They bombed all the way down this track. It was so much fun. They were totally exhilarated, and after doing it a couple more times, they decided, okay, our luck's gonna run out, we're gonna get caught, and so they climbed back over that blue fence and snuck out of the park without getting caught. The following weekend, those 3 same boys, along with 5 of their friends they had recruited, returned to Canada Olympic Park after hours. And so the 3 boys that had been there the weekend before, they led the group up the hill. They got to that blue fence that surrounded the luge starting house, and one by one, each of these teenage boys climbed up and over this fence, and they made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they began figuring out who was going to go in each of the 3 sleds they had brought along. And they determined they would put 3 boys in the first sled, 3 boys in the second sled, and 2 boys in the final sled. Because of how successful the previous weekend's trip down the luge track had been, according to the 3 boys that had gone, this time the group decided they did not need helmets because this was relatively safe. They also decided not to bring headlamps because they figured it would be more exhilarating to go flying down this track in the darkness. And so a little after midnight on February 6th, the first 3 boys climbed into the first sled and pushed off. At first, it was going exactly to plan. It was fun, they were going fast, it was exhilarating, but then disaster struck. Unlike the previous weekend, this weekend, there was a metal chain that had been strung across one of the sections towards the bottom of the luge track. It was there to keep a particular section of the track in place. And so these boys, as they come flying around the corner, they don't see it, and they strike this chain at full speed. Now, this chain was at neck height, and so when it hit them, it instantly decapitated and killed one of the boys. It was a 17-year-old named Evan Caldwell. And so he dies immediately, and the other 2 are thrown from the sled and landed unconscious. Now, back up at the starting house, they have no way of knowing this has happened to the first sled. Not only because they can't see anything, but also because the boys in the first sled are not making any sound. They're either unconscious or deceased. And so at some point, this second group of boys thinks they've waited long enough to account for the first sled to get down and out of the way. And so they load up their sled and they push off. And so they go flying down, it's going great, but just like the first sled, at some point they turn that corner and they hit that chain. But miraculously, the second group of 3 boys, they hit the chain in such a way that they kind of slipped under it. And so they were all thrown from their sled and kind of smashed into the track. But the worst injury of the second sled was just a broken ankle. And so this group, they stand up and they're totally disoriented. It's dark. They don't know what they just ran into. And before they had a chance to kind of collect their thoughts and yell up to the starting house to try to warn the third and final group not to go, it was already too late. All the boys could do in the second sled group was to just get out of the way as the third and final sled carrying the final 2 boys came bombing down, and they too struck that chain at full speed. One of the 2 boys on board this third and final sled was a 17-year-old named Jordan Caldwell, and he too, unfortunately, would be decapitated by the chain and would die instantly. And he was actually the twin brother of Evan Caldwell, the boy on the first sled who had also died. The other boy on the third sled would be thrown from the sled and would suffer grievous injuries as well. One of the survivors of the crash, who was actually on the first sled, his name was Caleb, and he was knocked unconscious from being thrown. When he came to, he was laying in a section of the track that was covered by a tarp, and at first he couldn't see anything, he couldn't hear anything, but he just felt like there was something lodged in his throat, and it was making it very hard to breathe. Most likely that was just from his throat being crushed in from hitting that chain. And so as he's struggling to breathe, his senses began to come back to him, and his sight came back, and he noticed he was laying down, and one of the boys who had been on the second sled was kneeling next to him. This was one of the boys that had not been badly hurt, and he had his hand on Caleb's shoulder, and he was praying for Caleb to survive. And so as Caleb is taking in that someone is praying over him, he notices somewhere else. His hearing is starting to pick up. He can hear someone else, and it would turn out to be a boy named Mark, who was on the first sled, who had been very badly injured. His face was very badly beaten up. He was laying somewhere nearby, and he was just singing this religious song. He was trying to keep spirits high, and he was trying to will people to hold on and to survive as long as they possibly could. And then Caleb remembered hearing someone calling 911, and then he doesn't remember what happened next. When the paramedics ultimately arrived within the hour, they got to the track and they found all of these boys spread out all over the track, because when they hit this chain, they got sent flying. But they discovered the twins were actually laying right next to each other, and none of these surviving boys had moved their bodies. And so even though the grief was just unfathomable amongst this family that had lost their 2 sons, there was some solace in the fact that despite having come down in different sleds, that the twins, Evan and Jordan, were together in their final moments. The 6 survivors of this accident would walk away from it with life-changing head injuries and other medical issues, and they would walk away with an indescribable sense of guilt and regret. But they consider themselves lucky because at least they survived. IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient, is a measure of someone's intelligence. To find your IQ, you need to take an official IQ test, which gives you an IQ score. The vast majority of people will score about 100 as their IQ, and so that's considered to be the average intelligence for any given person. But a very small number of people will score somewhere between 130 and 160. And so that's considered to be a very high IQ. Those are very, very gifted people. And then there is an even smaller group of people that score above 160. And so that is the genius class. Anybody who scores above 160 is literally a genius. To give you a sense of just how rare that is, Albert Einstein, who is largely considered to be one of the smartest people to have ever lived, he was not even considered a genius, at least not by his IQ. He was about 160, so right on the cusp of geniusness. But as we will learn from this story, having an exceptionally high IQ does not make you immune to making unfathomably bad choices. In 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Katarik, who had a genius IQ of 170, so she was smarter than Albert Einstein, she graduated from UCLA Medical School with honors. She completed her medical residency, which is like a multi-year apprenticeship for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, Angeles, which is one of the very best hospitals in America. After that, she opened her very own practice just north of LA in a town called Bakersfield, California, and she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, she was successful, and she loved what she did, and her patients and her students loved her right back. Fast forward to 2010, Jackie was 49 years old, and she was still running her very successful practice, and she was still teaching at UCLA, and she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the details of their relationship are not really publicly known, it's fairly easy to deduce from the reporting that came from this case that Jackie and William fought a lot. On Wednesday, August 25th of that year, Jackie was spotted by herself at a Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield, California, having some drinks. And then at some point during the night, she called a ride service to pick her up and take her home again. Even though we don't know this for sure, it's assumed she was too intoxicated to drive, and that's why she called the ride service. The following morning, Jackie did not show up for work. Her assistant at her medical practice is the one who noticed Jackie had not shown up, and so when she didn't, she called her boss, but her boss didn't pick up, and so after a couple of failed attempts at getting in touch with Jackie, this assistant called Jackie's boyfriend, William. And so William, he picks up the phone, and when the assistant asks him, hey, have you seen Jackie? She has not come into work today. William actually says, yes, I saw her last night. William would explain to the assistant that the night before he was in his house by himself in Bakersfield, California, not far from this restaurant where Jackie was last seen. And he said that at some point, unannounced, he saw Jackie pull up in front of his house. And so he could tell from her general demeanor and her look and her pace that she was upset about something, or he just sensed there was going to be some conflict if he went to the door. And so he decided to actually slip out the back door and kind of run away from his property before Jackie could see him. And so he actually left the property and went to a friend's house who was nearby and spent the night with this friend. And so when the assistant called William, William was actually still at this friend's house. He had not been back to his actual property. And so he would tell the assistant that, you know, the last I saw of Jackie, it was late at night. She had pulled up in front of my house, but then I split. So I don't know what she did. I assume she left. But William would tell the assistant that, you know what, I'll go back over to my house and I'll see if she's still there or if there's some indication of where she might have gone. And so William hangs up the phone, he leaves his friend's house and walks the couple of blocks back to his own property. And when he gets there, sure enough, right out front of his house is Jackie's car. Now, William knew his house was locked and Jackie didn't have a key. And so Jackie must just be sitting in her car waiting for him to return. And so William walks up to the car expecting to see Jackie and expecting probably to fight about something. But when he gets up to the car, Jackie's not in there, but her purse, her cell phone, her wallet, that's all over the inside of the car. And so William turns and looks at his house thinking, is she in the house? Did she somehow get in? Is she on the back of the house? And so William just starts yelling out for Jackie as he begins to walk around his house. And so as he goes around towards the back of the house, he's yelling out for Jackie. No one's calling back. And then he reaches the back of the house and there's no sign of Jackie, but he sees there's a shovel on the ground near his back door. And then he looks at his back door and it looks very obviously like someone, probably Jackie, had been using the shovel to try to pry open the back door. Like they were trying to break in, but it hadn't worked. And so William just kind of sees that and then continues walking around the other side of the house. So he's completely walked around the entire property. There's no sign of Jackie. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must have gotten in somehow. She's in the house somewhere. And so William goes to the front door. He unlocks his front door. He goes inside. And even though he knows all of his doors have been locked, all the windows are locked, he's kind of on edge because he's thinking she's got to be in here. But he walks through his house and there's no sign of Jackie. And there's no sign that anybody else had been in there since he was last in there. And so he's totally puzzled because it doesn't really make any sense that Jackie's car is out front, but he's thinking, okay, you know, maybe she got here and then she called a ride service and went somewhere else. You know, I'm sure she's fine. So William calls the medical assistant and says, look, you know, her car's here, her stuff's here, but she's not here. I don't know what she's doing. I'll let you know if anything comes of it. The assistant said, I really feel like something's off here and we really do need to call the police. And so William would say, you know what? I think that's a good idea too. Let's just get them involved and make sure she's okay. And so they call the police, and the police start by going to Jackie's residence. But Jackie's not there, and there's no sign of her. The neighbors haven't seen her. And so the police go to William's household, and they search Jackie's car, and they search William's house and the surrounding area right outside. But there's really no clues as to what actually happened to Jackie. And so after the police talked to a bunch of neighbors and friends and family, they just told William and this medical assistant that at this point, they just need to wait, and that hopefully Jackie will just come out of wherever it is she's hiding or wherever she's gone. Maybe she's upset. Maybe she was fighting with William and she's run off somewhere, but we just gotta wait and see what happens. 2 days later, Jackie was still unaccounted for. No one knew where she was. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her when William's friend went over to his house. William, the day before, so 24 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, he had left the country on a prearranged trip. But he was not being looked at as a potential suspect or having anything to do with Jackie's disappearance, and so he was allowed to go. And so this friend had been asked to go to his property to feed his fish. And so he shows up on Saturday, that's 48 hours after Jackie has been reported missing. He goes inside the house, and immediately he's hit with this terrible smell inside of William's house. And so he's covering his face, and he's walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell is coming from. He thinks it could be the fridge, maybe something's rotting that's fallen out, or the door's open or something, but it's not the fridge. He goes to the trash, it's not the trash. He goes to the fish, it's not the fish. He makes his way over to the fireplace, and he realizes that's where the smell is coming from. And so kind of reluctantly, he gets down and he kind of smells inside the fireplace, but it's not really coming from the area where the logs would be. It's coming from up in the chimney flue. And so he puts his head down and kind of turns and looks up the chimney, and about 2 feet up the flue, dangling down, are 2 human legs. And they would be Jackie's legs. It would turn out a few days earlier, when Jackie was at that restaurant drinking by herself, she did call that ride service to come give her a ride home, presumably because she was too intoxicated to drive. But before they showed up, Jackie just got into her car anyways and drove to her estranged boyfriend's house. And so she gets there. William, meanwhile, is sneaking out the back and running off to his friend's house. Jackie does not see him. She makes her way up to the front door and presumably tries to knock and get William's attention. But when no attention is given to her and it seems like no one's inside, she decides she's going to try to get into the house. And so the front door was locked, the windows were all locked. She got to the back door and that was locked, so she tried the shovel and tried to pry it open, but it didn't work. And so eventually Jackie climbed up the permanent ladder that's on the back of the house. There isn't much online describing this permanent ladder. It could be a fire escape or it could be some sort of lawn decoration, but there was something on the back of the house that you could climb up if you wanted to. And so Jackie climbed up this permanent ladder and actually got onto the roof. And then when she was on the roof, she walked to the center where the chimney was, and there was this cap over the top of the chimney to prevent things from going into the chimney. She removed the cap and then lowered herself feet first into this chimney. Now, it's unclear how quickly she descended this chimney, but eventually she got stuck because the width of this chimney was not uniform. It started fairly wide at the top and then narrowed as it went down. And so at some point, as she went down feet first, she would have gotten completely wedged. It wouldn't have mattered if her hands were above her head or by her side, because either way, they were useless. She couldn't bend her arms, and there was nothing to grab onto, so her arms couldn't do anything. And then below her, there was nothing for her feet to push onto. And so she was totally stuck. And since William was not in his house, he had left, there was no one there to help her. And so Jackie probably started screaming for help, but as soon as she did that and she exhaled that huge scream, her chest would have constricted from exhaling, and that would have shrunk her chest, making her thinner, and she would have dropped a little bit farther into the chimney. And then when she breathed back in again, her chest would not be able to expand back to its original position because the chimney would be restricting her. It's like this brace that's around her chest that as she gets lower and lower and lower, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so her lung capacity is shrinking second by second. And as her lung capacity shrinks, she would not have had the lung strength to emit a loud enough sound to get anybody's attention. Basically, she couldn't scream. She couldn't take in a big enough breath to scream out. And so she was just stuck in this totally compromised position in this claustrophobic little chimney where she could do nothing but wait and hope maybe William or someone took notice of the fact that she was in here, even though, again, she couldn't get anyone's attention. And so most likely she would have begun rationing her breaths because, again, every time she breathes out too much, she goes farther and farther, making it harder and harder to breathe. And at some point, starting on Thursday night, she would have heard William in the house. He would have been only a few feet away from her, but she can't make a sound loud enough to get his attention. And we know she was alive by Thursday night because neighbors heard someone faintly yelling help on Friday night. So nearly 48 hours after she got stuck in the chimney, it's believed she was still alive. And those neighbors, when they heard that faint call for help, they assumed it was kids in a nearby pool, and so they didn't do anything about it. When they found out what had happened, they thought, you know what, it was coming from that chimney. That's where we heard it coming from. Jackie would die shortly after the neighbors heard her calling for help because she was dead by the time the friend found her in the chimney the following day on Saturday. Jackie would die from mechanical asphyxia, which is basically suffocation, but it's caused by some physical obstruction. And in this case, it was the chimney. The chimney literally crushed her chest to the point where she could no longer inflate her lungs. It would take firefighters approximately 5 hours to break this chimney down to finally retrieve Jackie's body. No charges were filed against anyone for Jackie's death. It was ruled to be an accident caused by an unbelievable error in judgment by an unbelievably brilliant woman. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button needs a pair of socks, offer to loan them yours, but make sure you give them a pair that immediately slides down into their shoe as soon as they start walking. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and stickers and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballen where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.